And I think as addicts, our brains are so susceptible to the extreme highs and the extreme lows, and you don't seek those. And I remember once listening to another girl who was in a like strong recovery from her eating disorder, and she said, I really had to let go of that real like thrill and the real high and realize that actually it was a bit more dull life without my eating disorder, but actually because I had stabilized and I was much healthier physically and the lows weren't as low and the highs weren't as high, and I have a life now. And yeah, I have to face shit and I have to face like admin and I have to, face people being rude to me because my life isn't my eating disorder, which keeps you shielded from all that stuff. And like you said, moderation can be quite boring sometimes, like not binging on like 7 cakes and 3 tubs of ice cream and just being satisfied with like 1 scoop. It's like, oh God, I can't have every flavor in the shop. Like, really? But again, it's balance, and it's the same with exercise. It's anything.
I'm Paul Scolfort, and this is Powerful. In this series, I come clean about my own sobriety and the journey it took for me to get here. In each episode, I will speak to a special guest about their addictions and how they achieve sobriety and how they maintain a happy lifestyle today. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Pandora Morris. She's the host of a brilliant podcast called Hurt to Healing. She's a former lawyer and she is a mental health activist. Pandora's journey began when she was just a child. Her OCD and eating disorder manifests itself with restricting eating and chronic overexercising. And she has profound experience on living with OCD, which she's going to share with us. So in some of these episodes, there will be discussions of alcohol misuse, drugs, sexual abuse, suicide, and some other heavy topics. So please take care when listening. Pandora, thank you so much for coming on. This is powerful. I'm really looking forward to this. I think we're going to have a good conversation to help some of our listeners.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation too.
I would love to know a bit about your childhood, where you're from and how your childhood was.
So I grew up apart from my parents. Strangely, my dad's always worked in London, whereas my mum's sort of family were based in the countryside. So me and my brother were brought up there. And then at the age of 8, I went to boarding school in Oxford. So definitely had a lot of separation issues between the sort of the parents, as it were.
It's quite a lot for a child. I was going to ask you about if you had any traumatic experiences, but that's probably one, isn't it?
That's definitely the big one. I think I was always a really anxious child. I was always hypersensitive. I remember even aged sort of 4 or 5, feeling like an imposter in the playground, always overthinking friendships, thinking, oh God, who's going to be my best friend? Who likes me? Do they like me? Am I the most popular girl in the year? And I never felt that sense of belonging, never felt attached to anyone because, I now realize because I never felt attached to my mum. And so I was always looking for that from someone else. And I think that was where I went wrong, first of all, because what 4-year-old was going to ever be able to love me unconditionally and give me that feeling of connection and safety?
Yeah. It's sad, isn't it? Because I had similar stuff when I was younger and I don't know what set it off. Did you understand on a level then that you was thinking different from other people, or is that just your process and how you are?
No, I think I always knew that I thought more than my friends. I remember when I was about 9 and I was at boarding school and I had these very lonely moments at boarding school. I was always one of those people, there was a lot of masking that went on. So I was always in the cool crowd, quote unquote, but never felt like I belonged there. I always had, it sounds so ridiculous, aged like 9 to say, but you kind of had a boyfriend. And I always had a boyfriend, but never felt, I remember saying to one guy as we walked across the sort of school sports fields, do you love me? Are we going to get married one day? Am I the only woman for you? Do you promise that I'm the only girl for you? And just...
Did he say yes?
Of course he did. He was going to get a slap round the face if we didn't. But I also remember having those deep existential thoughts of who am I? I'm just this voice in this body. The world is this huge dark hole. And what's my purpose? Who am I in it? And I sent an email to my mum when you sort of started thinking about where you're going to go to secondary school. And I mean, I was already planning my career at the age of 11. I mean, I already knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to follow my dad's footsteps and go to university where he went. I wanted to, I mean, it wasn't normal, but did I have the awareness? No, I don't think I did, because I was so absorbed in my own little bubble that I just thought, this is how I am. And I didn't really think about what went on in any of my friends' heads.
But did you have a sort of ally early on, or someone that you could talk to about this? Because I remember for me, it's funny what you said, I used to have such profound questions that I'd asked people, teachers, my parents. And I used to look at my mum, this sounds a bit weird, but I used to look at my mum and think, if your eyes were different or you wasn't there and your voice was different, who are you? Like, what are we? Where are we from? And I used to have these questions all the time. And I remember trying to ask them, and I was very dismissed very quickly about, what are you talking about? Why are you thinking so much? My dad used to say to me, you think too much. You think too deeply. Why don't you just let it go? And I'm like, maybe I have more curiosity than you. But I actually really want to understand stuff.
No, I mean, I was very dismissed. I think the first time that I really let out my emotion, I mean, I was brought up in a way that was very Victorian in some respects. To show emotion was definitely a weakness. And my mum was quite a tough mother. I mean, I say quite, that's the understatement of the century. She was a very tough mother. She didn't impose expectations on us, and she wasn't one of those helicopter parents that sort of said, you need to get all A's, you need to be getting 10 out of 10 in every school exam, because I was already that perfectionist type of character. And I actually don't think she would have done that had I not been anyway. However, she didn't do emotion. And I felt very, very shut down. I wanted a very demonstrative, affectionate relationship with my mum, and I wanted her to hold my hand, and I wanted her to drop me off at school and to bring the best picnic to the sports matches. And she was just everything but that. And her language of love, I now know, was just completely contrary to mine. And I couldn't understand that as a little girl. So the first time I remember really breaking down in tears with her, I went over to try and hug her legs, and she said, "Oh, what are you doing? Just get off." And that was, for her, it was such an alien concept to be demonstrative. She had never had that. But I mean, my God, it's taken me like a real, I mean, 2 centuries of work on myself to get to that point of understanding.
I shared something very similar.
2 centuries, sorry, 2 decades.
No, I know, but I thought you'd done 2 centuries work in 2 decades.
Of work.
We could have left it
yeah.
at that. Look how much I can do in a short period of time.
Yeah.
I really feel for you because it's my father's upbringing was appalling, and I thought that he was too tough and too Victorian on me. And I've looked at and had real conversations with my mum, because my dad won't talk about it, about his upbringing. And actually, if I had his upbringing, I don't know what would have happened. The first time I hugged him was when I was in treatment, and I think I'd been there 2 weeks, and I was allowed to visit. And I just wanted, literally what you said, I just wanted a hug from my dad. I just like, give me a hug, give me something. And I gave him a hug, and it was literally like hugging a piece of concrete. I felt really let down at that point, but later on, I realised that my expectations of him, I was really trying to draw him out. Just because I had to work on myself doesn't mean he had to, and doesn't mean he had to change. And it was really difficult for a long time for me not to want that from him. But now, being a father, I can kind of see his perspective. It's very interesting. I know now that a handshake is like a hug to him, and I get it now. I can read his face now really well, and I've accepted that that's perfectly fine.
Are you over demonstrative with your children there as a result, or do you find affection and being
I am like a
tactile
big
hard?
bit of fluffy jelly.
Yeah.
I'm terrible. I'm actually I think I was very lucky because I studied acting for 3 years. That kind of took away any ego and any other things. I'm firm with them where I need to be, but I'm really stupid. Like, before I come here, I was doing Halloween things, and I'm on the floor dressed up as something, riding around the house like a horse. It's really, and I love that because I feel that that's important. And I have 2 girls, and I just love that connection. It's what I would love to have had as a kid, but I am firm on them when need be. I feel like there's a good balance.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I never had was boundaries. And I was Captain Sensible, and that's what my nickname was at home. However, they didn't impose any boundaries on me, my parents. So in a way, that induced this huge feeling of lack of safety. And I think they felt that they may be being kind and generous by doing that, but actually it was
Boundaries in what sort of area?
boundaries in that, I mean, this is slightly later, I'd say, like between the ages of, like, say 14 and 18. My mum would be like, "Oh, come on, why don't you have, like, if your friends round and have, drink, like, have a few drinks, you experiment with a few drugs." I remember once having a conversation with her, my brother, and and one of her friends, and we got onto the subject of like drugs. And my mum was quite naughty and like quite a rebel, and she definitely, yeah, experimented, as it were. And we got onto the subject of heroin. And my mum said to me, well, if, I mean, and this is maybe not something we want to put on the podcast,
We
but
can edit anything out if
yeah,
you want
I
to.
mean, she was just like, oh, well, everyone should just give it a go. And I just remember being so shocked. I was like, that's an incredibly addictive A-class drug. Like, what are you talking about? And just being so horrified. But again, there was nothing to sort of fight against, because it was almost like she wanted me to be naughty. She wanted me to be a bit more rebellious. And that just in itself for me was just, oh God, I don't know where I stand with anything.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I would have probably done bad if my mum and dad said that. My dad was really anti-drugs, and so was my mum, but there was a lot of alcohol in the family, and there was always booze around and celebrations. Um, I kind of had the opposite effect, because when I saw how people turned after they was drinking, whether it was funny and silly, but a lot of it was like arguing and got really hostile and quite scary, and bad decisions were made and things got broken. That put me off of alcohol and any drug, because I felt that from seeing it firsthand that I don't want to be like that. I want to have control.
Mm.
And I think that helped me for a long time, even as a teenager, when I went into boxing up to 18, that I was very controlled. And they used to call me the milk kid, because I drink milk down the pub, because I was boxing and I was training, and it was perfectly legitimate to have that. But really, it was about control. I didn't want to be out of control.
Mm.
So how long were you in boarding school for?
So I was at boarding school. Well, the intention was that I was would have been at boarding school from 8 until I finished school at 18. But I had a bit of a breakdown when I was 11, and I was sort of unconsolable. I was having like probably 3, 4 panic attacks every day. So they pulled me out for a month, and I remember the headmaster sort of got me into his study and said, what's going on? You have a house mistress at boarding school, and she's saying that you're upsetting the other girls. And that was all I heard. You're upsetting the other girls. So immediately that was just like a sort of knife through my heart, because I thought, okay, so this is all about everyone else. No one cares about me. No one cares about how miserable I'm feeling. So anyway, I was pulled out for a month, and I remember coming to London, and the safety of London had always just filled this emptiness inside me. I liked the hustle and bustle of the city. I liked being around people. My dad's always been a massive anchor for me and a big source of safety, even though he's a complete workaholic himself. But he was always he's older. He just always made me feel like I was loved, and he also just was able to make me feel safe. So I knew that being in London meant being with him. Anyway, so I came home for a month, and it was all quite weird, because I was still in pretty depressed. I mean, I was very depressed, and I got taken to a therapist, and she said, boarding school's not for you. What do you really want, Pandora? And I was so terrified, because I was scared of my mum. She was a very powerful, quite dominating figure, and I didn't have this sort of intimate relationship with her like a lot of my friends did with their mums. And so the therapist said, look, regardless of what you think your mum's going to say, tell me, what do you want? I said, I really want to be at day school in London. And so fast forward, I tried to go back to the boarding school as a day girl, but it was just a disaster, because it was like commuting from London to Oxford every day, and it was just exhausting, and it was too much. And also, there's a thing at boarding schools where there's quite a division between the boarders and the day children.
Bet, yeah.
And it was like quite a loss of face. And all
Yeah.
my friends were suddenly like looking at me like, oh, you're a day girl now, kind of, get away from us. You're not part of the cool gang.
Yeah.
And that was really hard in itself. And so I left like halfway between my 4th year. So I was there for 3.5 years in total. And then I started at my day school in London halfway through the year. So there was a very quick transition. And that was a really hard, it was a hard transition, because I had the Christmas holidays, and I just remember, again, just being like this bundle of anxiety waiting to start this new school. And although I was kind of slightly excited, there was this this terror that filled me about, how am I going to be? Are my problems all just going to disappear now? Because I still felt like, as we were saying, I was this voice in this body, and who was I? And I was just crippled with anxiety and very depressed.
What happens in the first panic attack? And for those who don't know, a panic attack, well, you can describe it. It's Horrendous.
That feeling of like being very short of breath, like feeling as though my whole body was being taken over by this sort of surge of panic. I felt as though, I mean, for me, a lot of it was like, I mean, crying, like you got having literally having a tantrum, being on the floor because I couldn't regulate my breathing, and just feeling this sort of, I mean, it was like I was a 6-month-old having a complete tantrum, basically,
Yeah.
and yeah, losing my breath, not being able to keep up. That's a and just try. I mean, I was like screaming at my mum quite often at the time of having a panic attack. The first one was at boarding school, but I would then start retching because of sort of like the lack of like oxygen going to my lungs and just the whole panic and my body just not knowing what to do, going into complete shock. And then just the tears and the tears and the sort of like combined with the hyperventilating, just feeling totally overwhelmed and just like, oh my gosh.
Did anyone know what to do at the time?
No. This was in, the late 90s, and mental health, panic attacks. It was like, this girl's going mad. Like, what is she having a fit? Is she convulsing? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on? And it was really disturbing for my friends. And so that was also the problem, because they then judged me and were like, what is going on with her? And because it was happening so frequently, I think the school then sort of started saying, okay, alarm bells, like what is this child going through? Like, she got a medical condition. And so it was tough. And those panic attacks kind of continued for a good few years. And I remember they started becoming more regular. And I'd be able to know when I was going to have them. So when I started at day school, it was like every evening, like clockwork at about 9 o'clock. I could feel the signs. And then, I mean, I was on the floor, just literally convulsing, having just like screaming, shout, like just, I had so much anger inside me. Like a
Yeah.
lot of it was this like pent up anger, and it was so directed at my mum. And it was almost like a subconscious way that I was trying to get her to hear me and to see me and to actually recognize that I was in such distress and I was hurting. I was really hurting. So yeah, I mean, it's funny, and the panic attacks started to subside when I found exercise,
Mm.
and that replaced the panic attacks. And so yeah, running became my coping strategy. But when I say running, it wasn't normal. I mean, I was running. I worked out with one doctor that I started seeing age 17 that by the age of like 14, 15, I was running about 25 miles every day.
Ultra marathon runner.
I was an ultra marathon runner. Unfortunately, then I like
Yeah.
screwed up my legs for life. But I mean, I was pretending to my mum that I was going the tube to school. I would run to school in my school shoes and like my uniform with my rucksack on. I would then I would go for a run before that. So before breakfast, I was very athletic anyway, and I was training for a local club. And so I sort of say to my mum, well, I'm doing my training run pre-breakfast. So I would get up before school, do that.
Mm.
Then I would put my school uniform on, do the run to school. And then at lunchtime, I was very good at pulling the wool over the teacher's eyes. So I pretend that I had a doctor's appointment. I mean, God knows how they didn't clock onto it sooner. But my friend would in those days, again, like your friends think that they're being kind and you're basically being enabled by your friends. So I would
Yeah.
open the fire escape and I would say to a friend, okay, at 2 o'clock, registration was at 2:05. Can you come and stand by the fire exit and just let me back in? So I then do 3 laps of Regent's Park in my lunch break. And then I would run home from school in my school uniform and the school shoes. And then my parents would quite often, like, they're quite social, they would go out in the evening and I would basically go out for another run. And I mean, this lasted for a good few years, until I then unfortunately was busted by one of my mom's friends who saw me like running around the streets of London. And yeah, I was in quite a dangerous area.
Mm.
And on the edge of a council estate, which was definitely not where like a 14-year-old girl should have been. And then I got my first set of stress fractures, age 14, and that was when I had to stop the running, and that was when things sort of really erupted again.
Because that, I can hear that. I totally understand. When I've had real bad, stressful moments, actually quite later on in life as well, when I was living in Hollywood the last time, probably 12 years ago, I had huge anxiety about certain things, and I'd do the same. I would just run for miles and miles and come back. And the byproduct was that I actually, even after dinner in the night time, like 10 o'clock, for example, I'd just go and do another run because I had to get this energy out. And I felt that it was a good thing at the time because my body fat went down. But I know what I was doing. But to be honest, for me at that time, had I not done that, then I might have ended up going back on drugs or taking something to calm myself down anyway. So it was a solution for a problem at the time for me. So stress fractures are pretty bad. What happens then? Because then you can't run. So how do you deal with stuff?
I found swimming.
Did you?
And yeah, swimming in a big way. I used to go to this pool. So basically, a doctor said to my mum, okay, well, she's going to have to exercise. I was literally like, you can imagine, like chomping at the bit. I mean,
Yeah.
at one point, my mum had to actually lock me in a room because she was so terrified of what I was going to do. I mean, I was just out of control. To start with, I was in denial about the stress fractures and I was trying to run. And, I remember just the tears because I was in so much pain and I was just trying to run through the pain. I was like, ignore it, you're weak. There was that drive. If only I can just do one lap of Hyde Park, I'll feel better. And then, so basically, a therapist said, okay, right, well, we've got to come up with a bit of a solution here. And anyway, I'll never forget it because we still slightly laugh about it now. But he said, so how much swimming, Pandora, do you think you should be able to do a day? And I said, right, 3.5, 4 hours. So, right, no, we can't work with that. And my mum was still sitting in the room. She's like, well, I think we can do, half an hour. I was like, absolutely not. Anyway, so the therapist sort of tried to be the mediator and said, okay, well, I think we can settle with 2 hours a day. I mean, thinking now, like this sort of 14-year-old girl doing 2 hours of swimming every morning before school, she's not training for anything. Anyway, my poor mother used to take me to a pool and she used to stand. I mean, I just never forget it. When the 2 hours was up, I had to hit, every time I went swimming, I had to hit. I think I was doing about 240 lengths. And if I didn't hit 240, it was like disaster. My amygdala was like, fight or flight, you're literally going to die. And my mum would have to stand there every time, I mean, screaming to the point where quite often she had to actually kind of try and physically get me out of the pool. And it was quite a male-dominated swimming pool. And I remember these men looking around as this like daughter was sort of swimming manically, like very skeletal at this point because I had also developed an eating disorder.
Yeah.
With this sort of mother trying to like physically restrain her. And then quite often what would happen is if I really had to get out and I would go into the showers and then I would sort of wait for her to sort of go around the corner and I would run back and I would get back in the pool and do like this 4 extra lengths. I mean, honestly, it was a painful time. And then I discovered at school that there was a local pool about 5 minutes away. So what did I do? Instead of going for my run at lunch break, I started sneaking off to this other local pool and I snuck in because, I can't remember. I definitely didn't pay. I was quite naughty. And anyway, I remember after doing this for about 3 months, my mum clocked on to the fact that I was swimming again. And I would never forget seeing her as I took a breath of doing crawl. And she was standing on the side of this pool. And it was literally like, that feeling in you when you've been completely caught out.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do. I was like, how on earth is my mum like on Baker Street at lunchtime and knows what? Anyway, so that was sort of prompt. I mean, the school then made an intervention and I was sort of banned from going. I mean, it was horrible, actually. I was absolutely miserable, but I was like literally restrained by my school then and that had very close eyes on me. So there was no more sort of, I'm going to a doctor's appointment every lunchtime. But yeah, I recovered much faster back when I was younger. The stress fractures sort of were fairly quick to recover. So within like 3-4 months, I was back running. And then, yeah,
it's amazing how if we were talking about a military thing here, it's like very cunning, very sharp thinking to how to do stuff. And I remember I used to think, like when you said about your friend meeting you at 2:00 with a fire exit, that would have gave me a feeling of connection with someone. So I would have thought at the time I'm doing quite well, like this is okay. I'm getting like connection with people. I'm doing stuff that's smart and it works for me. Did you see how bad it was getting at that time? Or was you still on the up? Because,
I was still slightly on the up. I think the injury made me realize this is not okay. And I do have this vision right now as I'm sitting here of myself going off with my crutches and almost trying to run with the crutches to this local swimming pool in my lunch break and being like, Pandora, this is not okay. Like, what are you doing? But the drive, it was that fight or flight mode that I was in. And it was I had to do it. I just had to get through it. And I think at that point, there was like a real low. There were moments like with any mental health condition, it goes in waves. And I definitely hit a rock bottom there. But then, I got slightly better when I could run again. And then it dipped again. I mean, throughout my life, I've had so many cycles. And that's something that I think explaining to a young person is really, really challenging, because you think you've hit a rock bottom and things are just going to get better. And actually, that's something I've learned, that's to never be complacent with your recovery, because if it's still a crutch, which this year, it hit me earlier this year, I was away traveling alone for 2 months, and think a lot of things went wrong and it was out of my control. So what did I do? I controlled my food more and I controlled my exercise. Well,
Yeah.
quote unquote controlled, actually got completely out of control. But those were my coping strategies, because I do tend to self-flagellate when I'm in distress.
Which makes sense.
Mm.
What were you diagnosed with and at what point?
So the first time I was diagnosed was when I was pulled out of boarding school, and my mum basically went to see a psychiatrist without me and explained all my symptoms, explained that I had an issue with the number 6, and I was praying excessively at night, and I was checking things, and I was then diagnosed with OCD. And I remember that she then went to our local GP surgery and said, "I've got a daughter with really bad OCD. Do you have any therapists like in the sort of the local area that you might recommend?" And they turned around and said, "Sorry, what's OCD?" And again, this was in 2000, like it was 2000, and so OCD was like, okay, what is OCD? It's just you're slightly superstitious and you maybe are a bit particular. There was, and I mean, look, I'm still fighting to raise awareness around OCD. It's still like very, very misunderstood as a
Yeah.
condition. And then I was diagnosed with anorexia when I was 14. That sort of coincided with my escalation in the running and the exercise, and got really bad actually when I was injured, because what did I start doing as well? When I couldn't run as much, I started controlling my food even more.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
It's sad because in addiction, there's a lot of crossovers with OCD and stuff. I mean, there's a funny story. My friend Dan, we left a meeting together, and I phoned him when I got home, and we have a really dark sense of humour. And I phoned him when I got home. I said, "Where are you?" He goes, "I'm still going around the M25. And I'm like, "Why are you on the M25? He goes, "I haven't found enough X's." I'm like, "X's on what?" He goes, "I'm looking for the X on a number plate." So I've been round twice. I'm like, Dan, it's like, got home 4 hours later. But we have a laugh about stuff, which is, you have to. I think if you find your people, it can relieve that containment of not being able to, not being understood, not being belong. And I think that's really important about a community. There's two things that really annoy me is when people say about, "Oh, I'm just being tidy because I have OCD." I'm like, you don't have OCD. You don't have it. Trust me. Or when they say, "Oh, I'm really addicted to like sweets." I'm like, would you kill someone for a sweet? No. Well, you're not addicted for sweets. And those two things bother me because they're banded around, and it really dismisses the life you have to live and the pressure that people go under, and they just don't understand. It's nothing to do with just being tidy. And addiction is nothing to, to do with just wanting something. It's having to have,
Yeah.
having to achieve, and it's like being a slave for yourself, isn't it? That
You
you
are.
have to do something. People don't understand that urgency.
No, you are. I mean, you're literally the prisoner of your mind.
Yeah.
And whenever I used to try and explain it to people, it just became this exhausting process, because like you said, the shame and the judgment and I never found anyone else who had really severe OCD. So what did I do? I bottled it up and I hid it.
Mm.
And like you said, it was literally this matter of life or death. Like if I didn't get that run, if I couldn't restrict my food and control it, I mean, the panic surging through my body, my heart rate increased, the tears I could feel like sort of welling up in the back of my eyes. And I mean, honestly, with OCD, it's such a hidden, often it manifests itself in a lot of magical thinking. And
Yeah.
you start to avoid certain things because you know that there are going to be triggers in a certain room. So you avoid that room or you avoid that person because they themselves are a trigger. Or like you said with your friend, you're driving for 4, 5, 6 hours. I mean, the lengths to which I would go in order to not have to confront an anxiety attached to my OCD were just extraordinary. And I still suffer with it. So I still have to manage it very
Yeah.
much.
I totally understand that. It's the same with addiction. People say, "Oh, I'm generalizing, but people say, "Oh, you okay? You don't drink anymore? You've not drunk for 20 years. Surely it'd be okay now." And I know in my experience that I feel once you're an addict, you're always an addict, and it's there. And it's not that you're addicted to alcohol or cigarettes or food. You're an addict, so it can come out anyway. Any behavior, any thought process. And I think that's totally misunderstood.
Especially with eating disorders, because, especially something like anorexia. So everyone sees my weight and they're like, "Oh, she's looking well. She must be better." And my dad's of the generation, he was born in 1946. He's that sort of post-war generation, doesn't understand eating disorder.
Yeah.
And I just will never forget, oh, little thing, well, you're obviously better now because, you're looking more feminine and more like a woman. And then, of course, I go back, a year later and I dip and my weight goes down. And so then the alarm bells start ringing for everyone. And it's like, oh gosh, it's still very much alive. And my parents have now, they've seen enough cycles to know that it, like you say, exactly, it still lives inside me. But what is so annoying is that it's such a visible thing, anorexia particularly. Yeah. And so people immediately judge you and, oh, you're looking well, you must be. And then the afterthought is, oh, she's obviously better, she's doing well. Whereas, at one point I was binging like you cannot believe. And my weight had sort of quote unquote normalized. But my God, I was then, purging with exercise, also purging occasionally, like, through vomiting. And I was in the worst state that I had ever been in. And it's just the misunderstanding that surrounds it is baffling.
I remember going into my agency and I went down to about 10 stone, I think. And I was just shredded. I've always been athletic, so I've always looked good. Not at the moment, but I've always looked good. And I remember going in there and I'd actually been unwell. I'd caught amoeba dysentery somewhere in Central America. So I hadn't really eaten for quite some time, was hospitalised for a long time. And then after, my mind went, that's all right now. I don't feel like eating anyway, so I just won't eat much for a long time. And I would just drop on the floor. I'd just eat salads only, and I would just drop on the floor in the middle of the day because I had no energy. I remember walking to my agent and it was like, don't move. Someone get a camera. He's amazing. Take your top off, stand there. This is the best I've ever seen you. And it was the most ill I've ever been. It's just, it's sad really. And, I'm sort of, I've kind of gone the other way now. I just sort of give up anyway, as I'm in my 50s. So I'm like, yeah, it's all right.
I think you're being very self-deprecating, but,
but
your own standards.
And that's the thing. Standards are unbelievable. I don't know about your standards. They are literally unattainable.
Yeah, that's something that I'm starting to appreciate more and more, because if I go now and do my workout in the gym and say, like, I sort of think I've done like a sort of 60% workout and I'm a bit disappointed with myself, I'm like, come on, Pandora, like by most people's standards, you've actually like killed it today.
Yeah.
And you are literally comparing yourself to an Olympic athlete who actually isn't healthy. I remember once a trainer said to me, and you know how these comments kind of sometimes just really stick. She said, but Pandora, athletes aren't healthy. Like, what is your perception of health? Like, what is health to you? If you are an Olympian, your body's not in a state that it can sustain. They're on the absolute cusp of injury, those people who are highly trained. And it's got slightly better now, you hope. But, they're always getting injured. Why are they getting injured? Because their bodies are overworked and often they're depleted and they're not getting what they need. And if you're not training for anything, like, why would you put yourself through that? And why on earth would you push yourself to that degree? But it's the Olympian mindset that I quite often like have to try and just bust. And it's like, it's like with my podcast, and I'm sure with your work and with what I'm trying to do, it's like you compare yourself to, so I compare myself to Stephen Bartlett. Well, it's not Diaries of a CEO, like my figures are nowhere near him, so it's a complete flop. And actually, it's catching yourself more often. It's been like, it's okay. And as we were talking about earlier, if you just make a difference to one person, that is okay. But the bar's always kind of rising, isn't it?
It is. And I honestly have done so much work, not for anyone else, but for me to really try to get rid of that. It's like I always felt like fractured glass, and this is uncontrollable, like crazy energy that I'd had. And even conversations, I'd be thinking, why did I say that? I couldn't listen to people. I'd be finishing their sentences. For example, with this podcast, my main goal is to help one person. So I have to have a sort of fixed idea that if I can change someone's life or help somebody, that's it. Because otherwise it's the compare and despair, isn't it? Literally, I'll always lose because I'll compare to the best of the best, or the people that are highlighted. So I said, we had Penny Mallory on, and I said to her, my goal is to find balance. And she's like, why would you find balance? I read a book about balance isn't great, which I understand for her. But for me, someone who's got addiction, balance is the A game.
Yeah,
you
I
know?
agree. If I can find moderation and like a bit more balance, and I think I interviewed a woman called Dr. Anna Lemke who wrote Dopamine Nation. And if you can get off that dopamine roller coaster, and I think as addicts, our brains are so susceptible to the extreme highs and the extreme lows,
Yeah,
and you don't seek those. And I remember once listening to another girl who had, was in a like strong recovery from her eating disorder, and she said, I really had to let go of that real like thrill and the real high, and realize that actually it was a bit more dull life without my eating disorder. But actually, because I had stabilized and I was much healthier physically, and the lows weren't as low and the highs weren't as high, and I have a life now. And yeah, I have to face shit, and I have to face like admin, and I have to, face people being rude to me, because I don't my life isn't my eating disorder, which keeps
yeah,
you shielded from all that stuff. And like you said, moderation can be quite boring sometimes, like not binging on like 7 cakes and 3 tubs of ice cream and just being satisfied with like 1 scoop. It's like, "Oh god, I can't have every flavor in the shop." Like,
yeah.
really? But again, it's balance, and it's the same with exercise. It's anything.
It's really important what you just said about the dopamine thing, because I tried to look at myself as a machine and it would just register if I had hits of dopamine. And then I was like, what does self-esteem feel like? Like, what does it feel like in here instead of up here? I did loads of self-tests on around relationships. So if I see someone, I'd be like, my brain would be start thinking about the girl and where we're going to do and the house on the beach and all of that stuff. And when that happened, I knew that it was more of a fantasy thing rather than a reality. So the reality, if I met someone I liked, it would be more feeling in here. So I had to kind of train myself to go from mind or brain to chest.
Mm.
And sometimes I'll like cut my lawn and I'll see the neighbour cutting his lawn and I'll wave. And I just think, you have no idea. This is brilliant. I'm just cutting the lawn. So it's weird because normal things for me have became like a warming process, like I'm doing well. If I'm doing something normal or moderate, I'm doing very, very well. And it doesn't matter what anyone else says because I know that I will drink you under the table. I know that I will train hours more than you
Yeah,
can
you're so
even
right.
possibly do. And it's kind of nice to have that. Let me try and be modest with it, you
Yeah.
know. After being diagnosed with OCD, did that help you in any way, or was it kind of because it could put a label on what was going on?
I think to a degree, but I think actually it's taken me probably up until I started the podcast to really own it. So I think having the understanding of what I had was helpful to an extent, because I could say to people, I have this thing called OCD, but like you said, there's so much misunderstanding around it. And my parents, they lived with it, and I mean, especially my dad, bless him, and I love him dearly, but he still doesn't understand it really.
Yeah,
My mum has definitely got more of an awareness, and I think there's that maternal connection, and you sort of slightly, your child is so much a part of you. If you can tap into it, she knows when my OCD is really playing up.
mm,
But I think most people didn't understand it, and I think I thought I understood it, and I was sort of logically, I did understand it ish. And I realized in the last, I mean, I'd say it's really been in the last, probably since COVID. I went over to the States, and I was lucky enough to have treatment over there because it got so bad that I was, contemplating ending my life, and the light had kind of completely gone out. I couldn't leave. I couldn't leave the house. And it's never really got to that level ever before. And I think everyone was struggling during COVID.
yeah,
But I thought I'd had the worst behind me. I'd qualified as a lawyer, and my head had said, right, once you qualify as a lawyer, like life can begin. You can really work on your stuff now. And it was, as we all know, like it was anything but. I left my job, and just things went from bad to worse. And at that point, yeah, I was on the wait list for an NHS unit, and that then closed down during COVID. And I just thought that was my lifeline, and that had been my opportunity to really try it, because I think when you have an eating disorder as a comorbidity with something else, that's often the focus, because doctors sort of say, oh my God, that's going to be the immediate risk to her physical
yeah,
health. We've got to keep her alive. So my OCD was never really focused on. And I think the OCD was always the real underlying issue, even though I definitely do have an eating disorder too. And I think when I went over to the States, I had the time to really start to understand what was going on in my brain. And so having the label was only helpful to a degree, but actually understanding how my brain was interacting and why I had these obsessive thoughts and had to do these compulsions, and really learning a lot about neuroscience and listening to people like Andrew Huberman
Yeah.
and, neuroscientists actually like and dissecting my brain. And I just think, God, if I had had access to these resources when I was in my teens, was I ready for them? I don't know. But I really try and tell people the importance of actually really learning about your brain, because for me, that's been an absolute game changer.
It's amazing, isn't it? I love his podcast. He's really informative. We had David Nutt on here, Professor David Nutt on here, and he's a neuropsychopharmacologist. And just to hear him talk about the brain, it just makes sense.
Mhm.
And I think that education is really, really, really important. Was it completely different in America when you went to where you went to?
Very, very different. For the first time ever, I had a treatment called exposure response prevention. So in the UK, your classic therapy, which is prescribed for someone with OCD, is CBT, cognitive behavioral
Yeah,
therapy. And then I tried a bit of NLP and sort of EMDR, which is sort of other types of therapy for trauma, and nothing really made any significant shifts. And then I was prescribed, as I said earlier, a cocktail of different medications. And I just couldn't understand why I was still so unwell. I mean, that literally my OCD just got worse and worse and worse. And that's what happens with OCD that isn't treated in a very interventionist
yeah,
way. It just metastasizes. It is like a cancer of the brain. And for the first time ever in the US, I had a therapist with me for 7 hours every day of the week, 7 days a week for the first
wow,
3 months. And we would do exposure after exposure. So exposure work in OCD is exposing yourself to the fear and then blocking the compulsion, which is the response that you have to try and like negate the fear essentially. So, for example, my OCD attaches itself to morphing into a wrong person. So I will categorize everyone I see into right and wrong.
yeah,
And this is just one part of it, because OCD is a kind of multifarious, like very complicated condition. So one thing I had was this absolute, I mean, and it sounds awful and judgmental, but this complete fear of being fat and being like destitute, poverty stricken, unlovable. And so if I saw a person that I thought fitted into that category, it was like they represented the devil.
yeah,
And my mind would take pictures of them. I would then have, I mean, I wouldn't be able to go near them. I wouldn't be able to look at them. I wouldn't be able to have a conversation with them. And I felt like such an awful, depraved person for doing that. But the OCD was why I was doing it. And then I would categorize other people in who were sort of right, as it were, and were safe as like my angels. And I would have all these patterns of people in my head. So all the imagery, as well as like physically when I went out, having to sort of make sure that I only looked at right people, because I was so paranoid about I've got a very visual mind. So my mind would take photos of all these people that I saw and would run like a sort of record constantly in my head.
yeah,
And it still tries to do it now, but I have to really fight it. And then it also attaches to new things, and doing anything new involves having to do all these rituals around food, exercise, and imagining people. So to start with, it was a very gradual process. It was all about, I couldn't say the word fat when I arrived. I couldn't say the word obese. I couldn't say the word homeless. I couldn't say unlovable, because all those words, it was like they were going to stick to me and they were going to make me turn into those sort of things.
yeah,
And anyway, so first of all, it involved like speaking out loud and writing the words and recording the words on my phone, and kind of almost trying to make you immune to the fear. And so then it so slowly progressed into then looking at images of like wrong people. And then I had to go out onto the streets and actually have prolonged interaction. I used to go into the homeless, it was ironic. We were in LA, and it was ironic that, that there's such a homeless problem in LA, because
yeah,
I literally was going with my therapist into these homeless, like tented cities essentially, and having prolonged interactions with all these different like homeless people. And the stories I heard, and the sort of, I mean, it was eye opening. And I mean, it was again trying to explain to someone what I was going through doing that. I mean, the panic, the sort of, to start with, it was like my heart would race. I would say to the therapist, I just can't do this. I can't, it's too much. It's too much. And slowly over time, your brain does start to rewire, and it's
yeah,
taking advantage of that neuroplasticity, and what David Nutt talks a lot about in his like research into psychedelics, which is what they're also trying to take advantage of. But they wanted me to stay there for 2 years. They said that with your level of OCD, you need to keep doing this like consistently. And obviously, budget and, time allowances meant that I just had to, I had to stay. We could only, well, me and my mum came with me, because it was an outpatient center. So you didn't
yeah.
actually live in the center. And so, yeah, we stayed there for 6 months. And then after that, my mum was like, that's all we can do. So then I came back and I had to continue to try and do that exposure work. But very few therapists in the UK do that hands-on work.
No,
And
exactly.
so I had to really try and take it on myself. And so, of course, I then went back to, I'm not to the beginning at all, but I went backwards. And that was quite disheartening and disparaging. But I kind of knew that was an inevitability of coming back and not having that support.
Yeah.
And slowly from that point, that was 2021, I've had to just rebuild on my learnings. But because I had the foundation there, and I know that every time my brain wants to go right, for example, I have to try and go left. And even if I can do that 10 times in a day out of having, say, like 150,000 thoughts,
Yeah.
that's progress.
Yeah.
And it's building on that and getting a bit of confidence and doing more new things. Like, even coming into this podcast today for me is an OCD trigger because it's a new thing. And like immediately my head's telling me, okay, everything has to be right after this. Otherwise it's going to open a wrong new chapter. So it's complicated. And I've almost got to the point now where it's like, there's no point in even trying to really explain my OCD to anyone or to rationalize it because it doesn't make sense. And that's the nature of the condition. So
that
yeah.
was so warming to hear. Like, well done. Seriously, it's incredible to hear, and to do all that work is amazing. I really feel like if you have a solid foundation, like honestly, a real foundation, it takes time, but then we have the courage and the tools to build our own house. So I always said about, like, I feel like when I help people with recovery as well, it's about contrary action. Literally, you explained it fantastically. And it's always about like having a thought, running the thought forward, running the process with it, and not doing action to it. So yeah, I think that's just touched me what you said there. I understand. It's a lot to deal with. It's so much to deal with, and people just don't understand, do they? Because they're looking at the outside, not the inside. I think that's brilliant what you just said for the listeners. Your podcast is great. How is that? How is that for you to do? Because you're bringing such a light on many areas of mental illness problems.
Yeah, so it's been, Hurt to Healing was born, 2 years ago now. And I really wanted to create a resource that I wish I had had, but not only that I had had, that my family had had and my friends would have listened to, because like you've just, said, I mean, I felt so misunderstood my whole life. And I kind of just wanted to come out with it because the shame as well was like eating me up. And I also wanted, it wasn't like I wanted to justify why I was at my stage in life and I was different to my peers. I wasn't getting married, I wasn't having kids, I was still living at home at the time. And I also wanted to bring a resource to people that would be useful. And actually, as you said, just touching one person, I remember that first person that tapped me on the shoulder and said, I really recognize your voice. Do you have the podcast Hurt Teething? And I was like, yeah, I do. And she said, I've just been in treatment for an eating disorder and it's really, really helped me. And I thought, my God, it sends tingles down my spine still thinking about that moment. And, and since then, like, it's grown a bit. It hasn't obviously grown into like what my head tells me that it's got to grow into eventually. But, I sort of carved out a niche. And I think I remember getting the first of, I say, I mean, I didn't get like loads and loads of messages from my friends because, not many of them knew about it, but I tried to send it to a few people when it started. And they said, God, we had no idea, like no idea at all. And as it's kind of words got round that I've got this podcast, there's been a slight level of respect that I feel that I've gained because, the shame is what eats us up ultimately. And it's the feeling of being judged by everyone. And actually, yeah, some people will judge me and think I'm a freak and I'm a weirdo. And as we were saying, mental health is still so widely misunderstood. But it's helped me bust that feeling I mean, of course I still feel it immensely, like I still feel judged and shamed, but because I've done something with it now and I've developed a sense of purpose, and I think that for me has been really crucial, is finding that purpose. And I've had so many years of shit in my life and I've reached such lows and I've been so miserable for so long that actually just finding that little thing and having conversations like this and feeling that I've been somewhat validated by what I'm doing has just been another step towards hopefully what I see as not recovery, because I like we were saying as well, I think it's something that's needs to be managed, But ultimately, it's given me hope that there's more to life than my OCD and my anorexia.
Thank you for coming on our podcast, Pandora.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Brilliant ending. Oh my God, I try not to cry then. I totally get it.
Oh. I hope I didn't go off on like rants.
No, you didn't. That was fantastic. That was so informative. This podcast is brought to you by Stride Foundation. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please head over to www.stridefoundation.com where you can find links to resources that may help. You can also make a donation. Please make a donation. It will help us bring to you more episodes. And if you enjoyed This Is Powerful, please rate, review, and follow the podcast to share it with your friends, your family, anyone you can, and head over to social media. I always love to see and hear how you react to the episodes, and it's so helpful for our content to be shared. Thank you also to my beautiful wife, Dr. Federica and Marty, the best producer, Shannon Delwich, to Henry, you know who you are, and to Emma Long, who does all the hard work in the background. And there's a whole catalogue of episodes wherever you get your podcasts. But did you know you can also watch it on YouTube? Just search for This Is Powerful with Paul Scolfer.